The full moon cast deep shadows as its rays struck the trees along the forest's boundary line. It was from these shadows that he watched her, waiting for nature to overrule willpower. It was inevitable, and it was just a matter of time. 4 months ago, Addison pushed the theater door open and stepped out into the crisp night air. The crowd had dwindled enough that she didn't have to worry about maneuvering through to the parking lot. Shoving her hands into her pockets, she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and scanned her surroundings. Most of the time, she wasn't even aware she was doing it. It was like she developed an instinct for looking over her shoulder everywhere she went. She had noticed she was more prone to doing it whenever she moved somewhere new, and since she had just arrived in town a few weeks ago, it hadn't surprised her that she'd constantly watched her back at first. She wasn't doing it as much now, but every once in a while she'd catch herself. When she did, she would just groan and roll her eyes. She did exactly that when she spotted a group of young men looking at her curiously. A couple of them flashed friendly smiles at her, obviously hoping to get one in return. She averted her eyes and pretended to hear something coming from another direction. The last thing she needed, much less wanted, was attention. From her experience, people saw even the smallest friendly gesture as an invitation to start a conversation. It was better if people didn't try talking to her, so she tried to be as unapproachable as possible. She knew what people thought of her attitude. After all, that was the whole point. People would avoid her if she avoided them. She knew it wasn't important what other people thought of her, at least not her personality. She would be lying to herself if she said it didn't bother her, but it was necessary. People shouldn't want to know her. It wasn't safe. She inhaled deeply, tilting her head back and looking to the inky blackness above. The sky was clear with the stars shining brightly, outdone only by the full moon. Where the lights of the theater faded to shadow, the silver glow of the moon blanketed the land. Addison was all too familiar with the monochromatic shades of night. Everywhere she went, it was always the same. The breathless beauty of the celestial wasteland had lost its appeal to her. She heard the door behind her open as familiar footsteps hit the concrete. A few seconds later, Naomi stepped beside her. "Why do people always talk during a movie? I don't pay to listen to them babble." Addison scoffed as her friend complained about the typical movie experience once again. The lack of common courtesy at the movies was to be expected, but Addison tried not to let it bother her. And tonight she had no sympathy for Naomi's suffering. After all, she was the one who had practically dragged Addison out to begin with. The annoyance was Naomi's payback. Addison shrugged. "It's a Friday night. The worst moviegoers are out." "Too bad we can't do matinees," Naomi said wistfully. "I bet they have more considerate crowds." "You could," Addison allowed, pausing a moment before adding with a smirk. "But I can't say it'd be great for your complexion." "Ugh, no thanks. I'm not partial to being well done. Though I must say I wouldn't mind having some kind of a tan. Being this pale wreaks havoc on my social life." Addison turned her eyes from the sky above. "You work at a bar. You're paid to be social." Naomi frowned. "That's besides the point." She looked over her shoulder at the same group of guys Addison had spotted earlier. They didn't bother smiling when they saw Naomi eyeing them, as most men did when a blonde-haired, gray-eyed woman looked their way. Instead, they turned and headed toward the parking lot with disgruntled looks on their faces. Naomi clucked her tongue. "Well, at least I socialize. You, on the other hand, avoid it like the plague." "I don't know what you're talking about," Addison replied in an uninterested fashion. She stepped off the curb and headed toward Naomi's car. "Uh-huh." Naomi's tone was teasing and disapproving at the same time. "Then tell me, why do you work third shift at a bakery when there isn't another soul around?" "I don't work alone," Addison replied defensively. "Grayson doesn't count," Naomi chastised, mentioning the one coworker Addison worked with on a regular basis. He seemed to be the only other person who was more reclusive than Addison, from what she and Naomi could tell. "I hang out with you, don't I?" "It's to be expected, given our condition." Naomi glanced around for nearby eavesdroppers. "Besides, I'm your roommate. Still doesn't count." Addison sighed in defeat. They reached Naomi's car and she stopped next to the passenger door. "Okay, you're right. I'm a hermit. Satisfied?" "Hey, the first step is admitting you have a problem," Naomi snickered. "Yeah, well, you're the only one who sees it as a problem." "That you know of." "I handle solitude just fine." Naomi eyed her skeptically. She unlocked the car and they got in, each effectively slamming her door in annoyance at the other. "You can't honestly tell me you're happy being alone," Naomi argued as she twisted in her seat to see if she was clear to back out. She pulled into the exit lane and they waited their turn to leave the lot. "I never said I was happy," Addison replied. Naomi came to a stop at the front of the line, checked for traffic, and pulled onto the highway. "What's the point of living if you're miserable all the time?" Addison's voice was quiet when she spoke. "It's just the way it has to be." "It is possible to be out around people, Addie. I do it all the time." Addison's thoughts flashed back to the dozens of towns they'd lived in over the years, never staying in any one place longer than a few years. It was necessary they didn't raise suspicions, and two women who didn't age would undoubtedly gain attention. Despite their need to lay low, Naomi hadn't hesitated, meeting plenty of new people and making friends wherever they went. Addison didn't think it was a smart move, but Naomi had ignored the possible consequences, blowing them off so she could enjoy an active social life. Addison could understand the need for interaction. Complete isolation took its toll on a person. Though she occasionally wished she could throw caution to the wind to be more like Naomi, Addison knew it wasn't worth the risk. "Well, I'm not you, am I?" Addison replied. "You don't struggle with it like I do." "Enough already," Naomi sighed in exasperation. "Ever since we met, all you've ever talked about is how difficult it is for you, that one day you might just lose control. But you know what? After almost a century, you haven't. Not once. If you don't think you're reformed by now, then..." She scoffed and let her voice trail off, undoubtedly to keep herself from saying something she would regret. While Naomi sat stewing in annoyance, Addison stared blankly out the windshield, not seeing the world outside, but rather the memories she would just as soon have to wipe from her mind completely. It wasn't simple like Naomi thought. She didn't know what it meant to really crave something. She could never completely understand. Addison had what could only be called an addiction. Years of abstaining hadn't made the craving go away. She just built up a tolerance. Decades had passed since her last encounter, and still her control was only marginal. It wouldn't take much for her to give in. Addison felt her mood darken as glimmers of her past reared up and demanded attention. No, it wasn't simple at all. "I just don't think it's safe." Her voice was a quiet undertone to the music on the radio. "People have more dangerous things to worry about than you or me," Naomi replied. "It's not just them I'm worried about. We have to consider the risk we put ourselves at, too." "What are you talking about? You think people pose a risk to us?" "I'm talking about exposure. The more people we allow to know us, the higher the chances are that one of them will find out the truth." Addison glared out the windshield. "Sometimes I think I'm the only one who takes that into consideration." "Oh, I consider it." Naomi glanced at Addison for a fleeting instant. "I just don't let worrying about it keep me from living my life." "I don't really consider what we do living." "Maybe not for you," Naomi said, sounding miffed. "But I'm going to do my damnedest to have a normal life as possible." "Normal?" Addison scoffed, but she regretted it immediately after. Naomi scowled. "At least I'm trying. Considering I didn't have much choice in the matter, it's the least I can do. The least you can do is cut me some slack." Addison didn't reply, and they spent the rest of the ride home in aggravated silence. When Naomi pulled into her usual spot in front of their apartment complex and cut the engine, Addison got out and slammed her door once more, this time with more force. She started off toward the center of town. "Where are you going?" Naomi called after her. "For a walk," Addison called back curtly. She stormed off before Naomi could stop her. She wandered around town for a couple of hours, grating her teeth over Naomi's words. She knew Naomi was right to an extent, but she wasn't about to admit to it. Addison knew she was right about the risk factor, for both people and themselves, but she also knew she was overreacting. She'd grown paranoid over time, and with a good reason. She knew she took it to extremes, but it wasn't something she could just turn off at will. She thought about what Naomi had said last, about not having a choice. Addison felt guilt creep into her conscience. Naomi was right. She deserved some freedom. It was the least Addison could do. That didn't stop her from being paranoid about it, though. When she felt she'd calmed down enough to face Naomi, she changed her direction and started home. As she reached Hillsdale Park, her pace slowed. It was a scenic little area overlooking the city's skyline to the south. The lights of nightlife were visible now, distinct against the dark sky. An amber haze enveloped the urban setting, separating the man-made world from nature just outside its bounds. Seeing the city again, even from a distance, intensified the anxiety she felt ever since they'd moved to Quiet Brook. It wouldn't have been her first choice to move to the town. She hadn't wanted to get this close to the city ever again, but for some reason she'd been compelled to return, to be closer to the city than she'd been in years. She didn't know why the urge had come over her, and when the time had come for her and Naomi to move again, she'd insisted they come here. The compulsion had confused her. It was completely at odds with how she'd always felt about the area. Her brain had shouted warnings at her for returning, for getting so close. She had run away from here so many years ago, vowing never to return. But here she was, looking out over the place that had haunted her ever since she'd left, a shadow that never left her side. This scenic spot was the closest she'd get to the city. She hadn't been within its boundaries in years, and she was damn sure she'd never set foot there again. She would avoid it at all costs. A pity, really. The city was such a beautiful place. Every time she took in the urban setting from this vantage point, she remembered living there as a child. For a short period of time, her life there had been happy. But things had changed, and her life had been turned inside out. Change, and the pain of it, had turned the city sinister. No, not the city, she had to remind herself. What resided beneath the city was what made her avoid the place she'd once called home. Until the real reason she stayed away was absolved, she would remain on the periphery.